Over the recent long Korean Thanksgiving Chuseok holiday week in Washington, the Korean government and the United States agreed on negotiating over amending the existing bilateral free trade agreement. So we want to discuss today how this came along and what both sides have in mind. And most importantly, what Korea will have to do to manage the process of upcoming talks. Right here in this program, Upfront.
Korea and the U.S. agreed to amend their bilateral trade agreement 5 years after it came into effect. During the second session of the FTA Joint Commission held in Washington earlier this month, both sides agreed on initiating amendment negotiations for the deal at the request of Washington. U.S. President Donald Trump has repeatedly expressed his commitment to overhauling the Korea-U.S. FTA, calling it a, quote, horrible deal. Ahead of the second meeting of the Joint Committee, Trump reportedly urged his top trade negotiator to portray him as, quote, crazy guy who could pull out of the deal any minute. While the upcoming negotiations are expected to be an uphill battle, some criticize the noticeable change in stance from the Korean government, which previously made it clear renegotiations were out of the question following the South Korea-U.S. summit in June. Others say the Trump administration is using North Korea's nuclear crisis to ratchet up its trade pressure under the America First mantra. The U.S. is making all-out efforts to ramp up its trade pressure on Korea. One day after Seoul and Washington agreed to amend the trade deal, the U.S. International Trade Commission found that domestic producers are being harmed by washing machine imports from Samsung Electronics and LG Electronics. The ruling hinted at the possibility of safeguard measures which could include imposing tariffs or setting a cap on imports. How should Seoul respond to growing trade pressure from Washington? On this week's Upfront, we shed light on a range of issues surrounding the Korea-U.S. FTA amendment negotiations and discuss possible steps Korea can take as negotiations kick off.
We have two guests joining in the studio. Professor Shin Se-don, he's a professor of economics from Sookmyung Women's University. Thank you very much for joining us.
Honored to be here.
And also we have Professor Ernst, he's a professor of international studies from Hanyang University joining here as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Very interesting subject here, the Korean delegation in Washington over the Chuseok holiday week, sending back to us the news that they have agreed suddenly to negotiate indeed the amending the existing free trade agreement. Mm-hmm. Quite a contrast, right? The previous stance of the Korean government. Korean critics have criticized the Korean government now as a result of this news that Korean government was saying all along that we are going to resist renegotiation, and all of a sudden they caved in. What's happening overall? Professor Shin, what's your view about the background behind this sudden development?
Well, at first, Korean authority didn't really realize how strong American position about Korea-U.S. free trade agreements. Mm-hmm. And the second thing is that, the argument that President Trump has been emphasizing terminating free trade agreements previously, we believe that was a bluffing. Mm-hmm. So until, Korean delegation visit Washington, Korean government had somehow doubted American real intention, and they wanted to know what is their real intention. And after having some talks, the first round of joint committee and second round of joint committee, the Korean government and delegation realized that United States is very kind of strong in making amendments in the free trade agreement. So now Korean, I think, stance is that, well, if America is so strong about making amendments in the free trade agreements, well, Korean government and Korean authorities has to follow the process.
Professor Ernst Lee, what do you think about this? Should Korea have been really afraid about the closing down the entire, getting rid of or giving up the entire FTA deal? What I'm saying here is, who's going to lose more?
Actually, I think we have to understand the nature of the negotiation. Negotiation is liquid. It's very responsive, depending on counterparts' response. So, from having looked at this, case that Korean delegation, how they have done in Washington, from my personal observation, I think they were very much unprepared and unprofessional, because going there just to check their, the feedbacks, to reconfirm what Korean government had thought might be right or wrong, that's too late, actually. We could have done in far advance by utilizing many networks in the United States what is real intention of U.S. government, or because there were pre-signals even before presidential campaign. Trump, when he was running campaign, he has repeatedly said he would like to terminate FTA. Whether it's right or wrong, I think we should have prepared a card for that. And going to a long way to Washington to reaffirm that our position was wrong was very much unprofessional. And actually, having said that, I think the Korean government should have prepared many other alternatives for the worst cases. And rather than just reconfirm what I thought was wrong, then come back. So on the Korean media part, and Korean media and Korean people should understand, and again, negotiation is very much liquid things.
I love the way this discussion is starting. Critical of the government and the kind of
supporting.
Supporting. If, let's say, Trump government says, forget about the deal. Since you don't want to talk about the renegotiation, we'll just get rid of the deal altogether. In theory, or in reality, how realistic do you think it could have been for Korea to say, okay, fine, no FTA, you lose more than Korea. So
that argument is I think, ridiculous. I mean, there has been some research on the part of Korean, side that United States will be losing more compared to Korea when the free trade agreement is nullified. But maybe absolute terms, okay, in absolute amount of trades, maybe United States will be greater in the size of effect. But relative to the size of economy, even though the U.S., the effect may be bigger in dollar terms, but compared to economic size, relative terms, it was almost nothing. So there isn't any real, loss in the case of, when the free trade agreement is nullified. I think, relatively speaking, Korea is more to lose than the United States. That's one thing. So that is, I think, why United States keeps saying that they are willing to terminate or nullify. But
so based on this relative calculation, you were saying perhaps the Trump administration was very serious about this, or what? Do you think it was a bluffing at all? No.
What I'm saying is, Korean argument that United States will be losing more than Korea in terms of, nullification is groundless when you talk about the relative term. So United States is I mean, they know that, relatively speaking, Korea will be losing more by terminating. So they used to kind of use that fact as a kind of a leverage to push Korea. But the real thing is what America really wants from these talks.
Okay.
Nullification isn't the choice.
Okay.
It's just a bluffing card.
So you believe it was bluffing?
Bluffing, less than 5%.
We'll talk about the background of it a little bit further in the discussion, but you believe it was a bluffing card.
Yeah, definitely.
And that means Korean government was taken advantage of, kind of like they were led by the United States by this bluffing card, and the United States won at this stage. I think what he said just seems to make sense. Do you agree with that point?
If I put my position in the shoes of Mr. Trump, I think I will do the same.
I see.
I'll do the same because in terms of negotiation, any negotiation, there are two factors necessarily identified. One, objectiveness. Objectiveness means both parties should agree upon some data. Based on data, U.S. is experiencing actually $23.2 billion deficit from Korea.
Okay.
This is the number agreed upon between Korea and the United States. And he's been pressured by its people. And second thing is actually hidden intention. As I agree, maybe it's blocking or not, but the balance issues. Because how U.S. government will try to resolve this $23.2 billion trade deficit in a way that they cannot touch anything. Take an example, steel, okay? Under WTO, the tariff is beneficiary countries do not charge any tariff, 0%. U.S. can be against all the countries in the WTO by raising tariff, which is very much unlikely.
Right.
And second one, automobiles. We're not paying taxes, 0% tax. But Japan and Euro cars are paying 2.5% taxes. Right. However, and based on these two things, U.S. government will have to do something. But what is real intention? Can they be against all the countries, or are they seeking for something else to resolve this 23.2 trillion trade deficit? I think Korean government should have looked into this part and have prepared what will be their hidden intention, rather than in a passive position tracking back to the U.S. government position and blaming them while we are not in a position to discuss about any termination or FTA. That's just one echo.
Very interesting points of what should have been done, after the facts here. Professor Shin, Professor Lee mentioned the deficits. Why is it Korea? Why can't they act with China and Japan more when they have much bigger deficits?
Yeah, as Professor Lee pointed out, the trade deficit is a real issue between United States and Korea. That's for sure. But if you look at the number, Chinese in a deficit, U.S. deficit against Chinese trade is 350 billion, more than 10 times. Germany, about 68 billion, which is about almost 2.5 times.
Jeez.
Japan, 70 billion. So in terms of trade deficit, United States has a significantly large amount of trade deficits against China, Japan, even Taiwan trade, they maintain it. So a $23 billion deficit is just one tiny reason that America is, pressuring Korea. There are other complicated and complex issues in this. That is mainly political reason.
Tell
political reason, I'm saying that Korean relationship with China, America is very sensitive about that.
Okay.
And the Korean government's position about North Korea was quite, doubtful on the part of the United States. So there are Korea-Chinese relation, Korea-North Korea relationship, and so those kind of political backdrops has been pushing America to emphasize or, quote, pick on Korea, unquote. So there are many political backdrops and backgrounds in order to understand the negotiations about the free trade agreements. So trade deficit is not the sole reason. So we have to solve all other political questions, in order to satisfy America.
I do respect what Mr. Professor Shin said in terms of the amount of the trade deficit. Korea is a tiny amount. But I look at a slightly different angle. It's not a matter of amount, it's an American policy, America first. So there are many countries enjoying bigger trade surplus against the United States than Korea. But United States trying to pick up a symbolic, a sample that they can use as leverage, giving the signal to the world, U.S. administration, U.S. government is trying to resolve trade deficit issues, starting from where? And between China and Canada or Germany, I don't think they have such kind of very effective leverage, which is North Korea.
I see.
So we are in a very specific situation. We can be, the United States can use Korea as a leveraging point with North Korea to deliver the message, U.S. first, a policy will be implemented. This is not just one time, but it will go on.
Okay.
So if I'm the Trump, I think I'll pick up Korea, which is 23 billion US dollar is rather than 350 billion. It's rather easy to resolve. Giving the strong signal. Even Korea, we are trying to long-time ally over 60 years. We are trying to resolve trade deficit issue. I think Trump administration is trying to give this strong signal or message to the world.
And Korea is not the only one. Korea should not feel too lonely because there are neighbors, Canada and Mexico. Actually, we know in August, Canada and Mexico have agreed and they entered renegotiation with the United States about their current NAFTA deal. And we are bringing here a Canadian expert here who's been watching the issue. He's Professor Yves Tiverghien. He's a professor at the University of British Columbia joining us. He's a professor of political science. Professor Tiverghien, thank you for joining us. First question to you is, we're just very much wondering about what the public opinion is as a background of this renegotiation between the United States and Canada, how things are going and how are Canadians seeing the United States and Trump administration. I think that will be a very interesting background for understanding the overall big picture here. Tell us about your observation.
Well, so public opinion in Canada about President Trump in general and about his trading policy in particular is very bad. In a way, this is a time of great divergence between the two countries. In Canada, we elected a government that's very internationalist, very pro-free trade. We see Canada as a trading nation that depends on free trade. And also is quite an idealist nation that believes in international governance, in multilateralism, in the UN, in a lot of those issues, and global democracy and human rights. And President Trump is going against all of those things, right, at the moment. So there's a general bundle of grievances in Canada. I mean, actually, President Trump is seen as a big shock in Canada. It's everyone talks about him every day, but in a very depressed way.
Okay, makes a lot of sense there. I wonder whether you're aware of or you're following the details about what's happening between Seoul and Washington about our FTA here. And relating to that point, we also wonder what Canada's strategy is in dealing with this renegotiation over NAFTA.
Right. So on Korea, yes, I saw the news a few days ago, and it's exactly the same pattern as with Canada. Now, when it comes to Canada's approach to NAFTA, well, it's complicated. That is because 75% of Canadian exports go to U.S. The U.S. is very, very important, right? So, and of course, our defense is completely guaranteed by the U.S. So we are so intertwined in a North American sphere that, in a way, Canada has to look like a partner. So if you have a president of the U.S. that wants to make changes, Canada has to look like a good partner and has to be forthcoming, right? It has to come to the table in good faith and try to improve things. It's a hard environment because the U.S. is not in the mood to give in anything, or they might give in anything that costs no money. Maybe actually President Trump doesn't care very much about the dispute settlement with investors. In exchange, he's going to ask for very, very tough unilateral measures that give more access to the U.S. in Canada or in Korea, but not in exchange for more access for Korea and Canada in the U.S. The U.S. is pushing for one-sided concessions for access to procurement markets in Canada. So Canada, of course, is trying to hold back and push back and avoid anything that's really outrageous because the government has to face the population afterwards. But while, of course, finding a way to not break down with a key partner. So it's a tough negotiation.
Thank you, Professor Tiverghien. Very interesting points here. But I have this question. People don't know the whole package. And each side finish their negotiation, go back home. They claim their own victory by highlighting different parts of the deal. That's my view. What do you think?
Well, actually, that's an excellent point. Well, in terms of the negotiation again, we have to try to look into what are hidden intentions. But the fact is, again, repeatedly saying, we are enjoying trade surplus $23.2 billion against the United States. But in the area of steel or automobile things, we cannot resolve it in one day. But we have to suggest alternative solutions, how to resolve to the United States, how to resolve this trade deficit, $23.2 billion trade deficit, in a way that we can enjoy alternative solutions or substitute effect. Take an example, energy.
Right.
We're importing about 60% of oil from Middle East, long way from Middle East all the way to the Korea. But it is quite understandable for Korean government standpoint to diversify energy resources, which Middle East countries do agree. So recently there are shale oil and shale gases from Springfield and Texas through the widened Panama Channel. We can import this shale oil and shale gas for the diversification of our energy resources, downing 20% of energy cost, which is government policy, but which has not been done yet. So we can suggest something like that. So instead of something that still under WTO umbrella or automobile, this is not a single country deal. This is multinational deal. So we have to establish an alliance with other countries in the same position. But at the same time, we have to give solutions or other alternatives to the United States that we are trying to resolve this 23 billion trade deficit issue in a way that they can export more resources to Korea. So this is something that we should do rather than, tackling on something harder to resolve in one day. In the nature of FTA, approval, it takes time.
You compare NAFTA renegotiation with Korea, but what I feel is that Korean case is more complicated, more difficult than NAFTA, because if you look at the trade statistics, trade between America and Mexico or Canada, much bigger. So the real issue at the NAFTA renegotiation is real economic issue. But in Korea, it's more political and more military issues involved. So what is the real intention of the United States in renegotiating free trade agreement is more complicated than NAFTA. That makes the whole issue in Korea make the issue more difficult.
Then, Professor Shin, would it be actually easier, flipping your argument around, would it be easier for both countries to agree on a deal between U.S. Korea? Because this will be much about political symbolism rather than real specifics of economic real
in some sense, easier, because Korea may change political stance against China or stance against North Korea. So it doesn't cost very much. Okay, so in that sense, maybe very easy, easier than the NAFTA case. But it becomes very difficult in the sense that, what they want, what the United States wants is not economic matter. There are some political or military asking. That's going to be really difficult. That's one thing that I want to make. And another very good, important, lesson that we learned from the discussion about NAFTA is that America wants increased market access, increased condition for American trades in, government or public procurement, and easier access to Korean investment, deregulation of financial services. So there are a whole bunch of other areas so far has been blocked under Korea United States Free Trade Agreement. So I think real intention of the United States is kind of easing the process of so far highly protected areas such as investment, services, or cross-border trades. So I think their intention is to open up more in that area. And real question is Korean politics, Korean general public will accept increase in those areas. That, I think, is the real issue, whether the negotiation will be successful in the future.
I don't agree with that because political issue, from your standpoint, we should be here in the Korean Peninsula confronting with China. So the position of Korea will be as much important as now in the future from political standpoint or military standpoint. But the economic issue is different. So this is my personal view. So in terms of economic issue, as Professor Shin pinpointed, I think Korean government should acknowledge what are real intentions, hidden intentions, such as opening financial markets, opening more IT, intellectual property markets, things like that. And we have to suggest that. But we haven't prepared that anything. We just said, we will not join in the termination or renegotiation of termination of the U.S.-Korea FTA. We repeatedly proclaimed, and we went to U.S., we And we confirm that we are pushed to agree on that, to renegotiate.
Okay, I thought I initially fully agree with Professor Shin Se-don's optimistic observation about where the focus will be at the end of the day, but also Professor Ernst Lee's point about having to have broad scope to get the final result more productive makes a lot of sense. So I have learned a lot. Thank you very much, Professor Shin and Professor Lee.
It's been my pleasure.
For your wonderful
Thank you.
views here. And I'm sure our viewers have also learned a lot, like I did, about this very sensitive subject. And likewise, next time when we talk about all these issues that matters for Korea as well as the world, we want to ask you to join us again. Until then, this has been Kim Byung-chul. Thank you very much.